So moving on to more serious things, I'm delighted to introduce Michael Moynagh as our keynote speaker for this afternoon. As you may have read in your booklet, Michael is a consultant to the National Fresh Expressions team and also on the staff at a college in Oxford, Wycliffe Hall. Michael.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the welcome, and I'm really glad to be here. Really enjoyed this morning, fabulous sessions that I attended the two this morning, and have enjoyed the conversations and so on. And I'm now really pleased to be able to talk about how we hold together tradition and innovation. On the one hand, obviously, we have tradition, which is established ways of doing things, accepted customs, beliefs, practices, and so on. And then on the other hand, we have innovation. And innovation changes the rules of the game. You can have radical innovation. The first Messy Church radically changed the rules of the game for doing all-age worship. And you can have incremental innovation, incremental changes to the rules of the game. In a Messy Church, perhaps, you might change the sequence of craft activities, worship, and food. So, how do these two things, tradition and innovation, relate to each other? Well, it should go without saying that it's in the nature of tradition to innovate. If a tradition remains still for too long, it risks becoming detached from reality. And that's because reality never stands still. And so if a tradition is to stay relevant to real life, it must keep up, as it were, with the changes round about it. That, I think, is one of the themes of the book of Job. You'll remember that Job's so-called comforters based their responses on what they've learnt from the tradition. Their tradition says that a righteous man will be blessed and an unrighteous man will be cursed. Well, here's Job apparently being cursed. Therefore, their tradition says, he must be unrighteous. But Job, of course, he cries out against all that. He says, well, I don't agree with you. I don't see how I've been unrighteous. And as David Ford points out, the reader is left with the question, what happens when the tradition no longer works? What do you do when the tradition no longer accords with everyday experience? Because that's what Job was finding. The tradition did not work for him. And in those circumstances, the answer is that you start to innovate. Innovation is born when you wrestle with the issue, the tradition no longer works as well as it did. What should we do now? Innovation arises when there's a felt need, if you like, for tradition to catch up with experience. But on the other hand, innovation cannot arise only from experience. Innovation only takes root when it connects to the tradition. Eons ago, I wrote my PhD on a history of the sugar industry in Fiji. I thought I'd just drop that in so you know what my qualifications are for speaking to you. And I remember reading how the first missionaries in the Pacific encouraged their converts to practice generosity. Many of the islanders, in their tradition, generosity was a means of gaining status. The more you gave, the higher the status you had. And so giving occurred very publicly. And the missionaries quickly cottoned onto this. They encouraged Christians during worship to throw their offerings into the middle of a circle. People would see how much everyone was giving, and the person who gave most would have their social status confirmed. I must say, I always thought this was a brilliant idea, but it never quite worked for me in the parish. I don't really know. Anyway, you'll see the point I'm making. Christianity was a huge innovation for the Pacific Islanders. And one reason it took root, as so often has happened in history, is that missionaries found ways of connecting this innovation to the pre-existing tradition. When you connect the new to what already exists, people are enabled to own it. So you see, on the one hand, innovation happens when the tradition seeks to catch up with changes in social experience. But on the other, innovation also happens when you connect the new to the tradition that already exists. So the issue is not either tradition or innovation. The question is how the two are combined and how they feed off each other. What I want to do for the next few minutes is to describe 6 processes involved in innovation. These processes are not sequential. They interweave in and out of each other and are closely connected. But I hope they'll suggest how innovation and tradition exist in a dynamic relationship and in many ways depend on each other. The first process of innovation is dissatisfaction. And you'll see clear overlaps and resonances here with what Kathy was talking about this morning. Innovation doesn't happen unless there is dissatisfaction with the status quo. You would never do anything new unless you were discontent with the present. Perhaps the present isn't working. Perhaps you can see better ways of doing things. You feel dissatisfied because the present could be improved. This was Caroline's experience. She was a school teacher in northwest London. The local population had changed. There were a growing number of immigrants and others from ethnic minority backgrounds. And Caroline felt frustrated because her local church, if you like, her local Christian tradition, had so little contact with the changing population. This discontent fueled her determination to do something about it. Innovation starts with dissatisfaction. If you like, it's a holy discontent or a prophetic discontent. It's a dissatisfaction that says the tradition as we've got it, it's not working as well as it might. The old must be revealed as inadequate before the new is born. And this is a challenge to all of us who are leaders and who think that the main task of leadership is to keep everyone happy. Well, if you want improvement, you need some people not to be happy. The second process is exploration. You're exploring how something new might work within your tradition. Caroline, for example, began to explore how her church might make connections with its new neighbours. How might her church embrace something new that would build relationships with the people round about? And how might it do this while remaining faithful to the tradition that it had inherited? How did Caroline go about this exploration? Well, she did 4 things. First, she started with what she'd got: who she was, what she knew, and who she knew. Who was she? Well, she was a primary school teacher. What did she know? She knew that many of the mothers of the children she taught could not speak English or could not speak it well. She also knew how to teach. So could she use her teaching skills, she wondered, to help these mothers in some way learn better English? Who did Caroline know? Well, she knew some people in the church who might be willing to help her. Secondly, she began to ask herself, what if? What if I did this? What if I did that? This is an important part of the exploring process. In his book on design thinking, Nigel Cross describes how engineers, architects, and other designers, how they approach design problems by thinking about possible solutions. They keep asking, what if, till a solution emerges. And that's what Caroline did. She was designing a solution to the problem of ethnic women not speaking English. So she began to think about possible approaches. One solution she considered was to run a language course. But she realized that this would involve writing course materials, setting assignments, and that she'd probably need qualified helpers. All that would take too much time she didn't have. And so she dismissed the idea. Eventually she asked herself, what if we ran a weekly language cafe? What if we invite the women to an English afternoon tea, sit them around small tables, and invite them to discuss a topic in English? Now, I don't know whether she said wow at this point, but often when you keep asking what if, when eventually you get what you think might be the answer, you go, wow. And then, as happened with Caroline, you try the idea to see if it'll work. What if? What wows? What works? Thirdly, Caroline listened carefully to the people she hoped to serve. Now, sometimes if you know people well, you do this listening implicitly. You do it by holding conversations in your head. In your imagination, you ask people what they think of an idea, and then you imagine how they might reply. And I think because Caroline knew the community that she was involved with, she knew it well through her teaching, she did quite a lot of this implicit listening. So she imagined herself inviting these mainly Sri Lankan mothers to afternoon tea in the church hall. And as she pictured herself doing this, she realized that many of them would find it quite daunting. The church was not part of their housing estate. And so she decided to use the community hall instead. The facilities weren't so good, she'd have to pay for them, but it was familiar territory for the women involved. Caroline listened carefully, implicitly, but she also consulted some of the Sri Lankan women as her plans took shape. Then, when she had a concrete plan, she tried it out. She experimented to see if it would work. Caroline started with what she had. She kept thinking of possible solutions. She listened attentively and she tried it out. By starting with what she had, she didn't waste time coming up with ideas that were beyond the resources available to her. Nor did she try to innovate in a field that was outside her expertise. She built on what she was familiar with. By thinking of different possible solutions, she widened her thinking to embrace an unexpected possibility. And by listening carefully, she checked her idea would work, and then she shaped it around the women concerned. Then she experimented. She took nothing for granted. And that, I would suggest, is the essence of the exploration process. The third overlapping process of innovation is making sense to yourself and to others of the idea that begins to emerge. Why does it make sense to me? Why could it make sense to you? I want to say that this is a more subtle process than coming up with a vision, because it's about telling different yet consistent stories to the people involved, stories that will convince them by connecting with their histories. And this is what Caroline did. She told a story, first of all, to herself. She'd read Mission Shaped Church. She was very taken by its incarnational theology. And so she told herself a very simple story. Just as the Son of God went out to the culture of first century Palestine, so in a small way, I'm trying to go out to the people around here who are from Sri Lanka. To her local church, she told a slightly different story. She said, "For over 100 years, we've supported overseas mission. Well, overseas has now come to our doorstep. What are we going to do about it?" And then to the Sri Lankan women, she told a different story again. "We want to be good neighbours to you and welcome you to this part of London," she said. "Would like to invite you to tea and help you to practice your English." 3 different stories, all consistent with each other, with a common thread, but each story connected to the tradition or history of its audience. Caroline's story to herself connected with her tradition, if you like, of missional concern. She was passionate about the church reaching out. Her story to her church connected with its tradition of supporting overseas mission. And her story to the Sri Lankan women connected to their recent history of arriving in the UK. Storytelling is vital to the whole process of innovation. And many innovators and pioneers and so on, they do this instinctively. But my observation is that sometimes stories could be improved if innovators were more intentional about their storytelling. Particularly in a church context, some pioneers might find it helpful to think more carefully about how they connect their stories to the different traditions of the different audiences they end up having to address. I've termed the 4th process of innovation amplification. It's a process by which innovation grows and spreads. It amplifies. And central to this process is the role of networks. And innovation will spread through networks if people are well connected. If people are not well connected, the innovation will spread more slowly. As many of you know, especially important in these networks are connectors, people whose role is to connect people up. A connector is someone who knows everyone else and whose views are taken seriously. In mission circles, they're often called people of peace. They open doors to their friends and contacts. If you've got the support of a good connector, you don't have just one person buying your innovation or coming to your new type of Christian community. You have lots of their friends and neighbours showing interest as well. Caroline was almost certainly a connector herself. As a teacher in the local primary school, she knew many of the Sri Lankan families, children that she'd taught. And she was able to invite the mothers of the children in her class and the mothers of children she taught in previous years. Understanding the role of connectors is important if you're an innovator. Your innovation is most likely to spread if you can persuade a connector to introduce your innovation to their networks. And some innovations don't succeed, they don't take off, because there's no connector to spread the news about them. It may be a brilliant idea, but there is no connector to make it amplify. But connectors on their own are not enough. The innovation has to make sense to the connector. The connector has to be enthused by a story. And that's why storytelling is so important. And that's why I said at the beginning that these processes of innovation, they all overlap and they feed into each other. They jumble up into a sort of great mess in real life. The 5th process of innovation is what some people describe as staying on the edge of chaos. The edge of chaos refers to the boundary between order and chaos. If you're too far in the orderly direction, then what you're doing tends to get fixed and stuck. Too much order stifles change. But by contrast, when you move towards chaos, you move away from order and towards change. And the danger here is that you move too far in the direction of change, you fall over the cliff, as it were, and your initiative disintegrates. You end up in a state of chaos. When you innovate, you need to keep a balance between order and change. You don't want to change too much too quickly, otherwise people feel overwhelmed, it all feels too chaotic, and they stop volunteering to help. Equally, you don't want to get stuck in a rut. You don't want to be too far in the direction of order. Otherwise, you may miss the opportunity for some further change that could enhance your innovation. When Caroline's Language Cafe started, it could easily have got stuck. She and her volunteers might have settled into a weekly routine. Every Thursday afternoon, tea was served, guests were encouraged to discuss a topic in English, the hall was cleared up afterwards. Week by week, the same thing might have happened. But Caroline wasn't content for that. She was open, indeed, looking for something more. She kept herself on the edge of chaos. I know this because I met Caroline accidentally when she was training for ordination. And I remember her describing to me her language cafe. And then Caroline said, you know, the trouble is, Mike, we've got a bit stuck. I don't know how to move on to the next stage. I want to be able to share the gospel appropriately with these Sri Lankan women, but we don't know how. Here was an attitude that was distinctly open to more, to change. In the conversation, I suggested that her team invite the women to submit prayer requests and offer to pray for them. And Caroline took that suggestion back to her team, who decided to set up a prayer board. The women pinned their requests to the board, and then they all began talking about them, which is not what anyone had expected. And this raised, if you like, the spiritual temperature at the cafe, so that in time, the team was able to follow this up with an alpha course at a different time of the week, specifically for guests of the cafe. You see, what was happening was that Caroline's innovation, the Language Cafe, was developing its own weekly tradition. Afternoon tea, discussion round tables, clear up afterwards. But Caroline remained on the edge of chaos. She refused to get stuck in the tradition that was emerging. She remained open to the possibility of further innovation. And when the idea for a further innovation was put to her, the team adapted the idea so that it would fit in with the emerging tradition of the cafe. The prayer board was new, but it wasn't intrusive. The idea of prayer was familiar to many of the Sri Lankan women who had a religious background. The prayer board could take because it fitted into the tradition of the cafe and of its guests, even though the tradition of the cafe was relatively short. Edge of chaos is about sitting on the boundary between being faithful to the tradition, including the developing tradition of your innovation, and being open to change. And some people find it an uncomfortable position to be in because you're not in control. Caroline was open to further change, but she didn't know what to do. All she could do was to wait and ask questions. But she didn't know where the answer would come from, nor even if she would get an answer. The answer, in a sense, was beyond her control. So often leaders of innovation want to control what happens. They close down possibilities. And in so doing, they impose too much order on their initiative. If you want to leave room for the Spirit to act, often you have to give up control. You have to leave the future open. You have to be willing for change to come from an unexpected direction. If I was developing a spirituality of innovation, this would be one of my starting points. Giving up control. What sort of spirituality encourages and enables that? The last of my 6 processes is transformation. Innovation brings about transformation among those involved. Some of Caroline's Sri Lankan women attended the Alpha course and then continued to meet for regular Bible study. And who knows what changes in outlook and behavior resulted from that. Caroline's volunteer helpers, they gained in confidence and began to see themselves as being more capable. Caroline herself experienced a change. Before starting the cafe, she saw herself as someone with gifts sitting in the pews. Successfully launching the cafe encouraged her to see herself as someone with the ability to lead something new. There was a change in her self-identity. She began to see herself in a different way. And her local church began to see itself differently too. The congregation gained confidence in mission, and this contributed in a small way to the start of a messy church and of a debt counselling centre. There was a change in the church's identity. It still came from the same tradition, but it began to articulate that tradition in new forms. Innovation need not be a threat to tradition. It can enable a tradition to find new means of expressing itself. So 6 processes of innovation: dissatisfaction, exploration, sense-making, amplification, edge of chaos, and transformation. It's not the only way of thinking about innovation, of course, but I hope you'll find this as helpful as just one way to put alongside others. If we wanted to develop a theology of innovation, where would we start? Well, some people suggest that we start with creation. God innovated when he created the universe. But Christians have traditionally said that creation was from nothing. God used no pre-existing materials to form the universe. And this is difficult when we talk about innovation, because innovators don't start with nothing, they start with what they've got. In fact, the essence of innovation typically lies in bringing together 2 or more elements that were previously kept apart. You combine 2 or more ingredients in a novel way, and innovation results. Cafe and church would be an obvious example. So I don't think we can build a theology of innovation from creation, but I do think we can theologize about innovation by reflecting on the new creation. The kingdom of God, I would suggest, is innovation on a cosmic scale. God is dissatisfied with the existing creation. He starts with what he's got, the world as it is, to bring about a new order, the kingdom of God. Scripture contains multiple stories that help us to make sense of this new kingdom. One of these stories is about the kingdom being like a mustard seed. The seed grows into one of the largest trees in the garden and spreads. In other words, the kingdom amplifies. The kingdom is always on the edge of chaos. It brings things that are new, but these novelties are integrated into what already exists. So Revelation can talk about the new heaven and the new earth. The kingdom is new, but recognizable as the universe with which we're familiar. Order, familiarity, is balanced with change, with novelty. The kingdom is not so orderly that little change occurs, nor so dramatically new that the old vanishes into chaos. The result of the kingdom is that our identities are transformed. Humans are transformed into children of God, into brothers and sisters of Christ. Innovation, I would suggest, happens when God's future comes head to head with the present. The result is not the obliteration of tradition, it's the transformation of tradition. When the kingdom comes, history receives new life. Innovation fertilizes the tradition. And tradition is the soil in which innovation grows. Thank you for listening. So in your tables now, if you will, I suggest you just talk together for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a more plenary time. But just for 10 minutes or so, what, if anything, excited you in what I said? What do you want to think more about? And what did you disagree with? What excited you in what I said, if anything? What do you want to think more about? And what did you disagree with? If you can just talk about that in your tables, and then in 10 minutes or so, we'll have a time for people to comment, feedback, ask questions, or whatever.
Can we call you back to order, please? We're going to have two roving microphones moving around, Liz and Ali, I think. And if you'd like to make a comment or question or any of the three questions that Michael asked you to think about, then please raise your hand. Brian's he hasn't. Anybody like to say, question, anything, comment, question? Oh dear. Oh, Emma down here. And then somewhere miles away at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I found that immensely helpful, and particularly giving some words and a bit of a structure to things that I can recognise and connect with in terms of innovating. But when you're facing change, you talk about dissatisfaction, which again is very freeing, that some people need to be dissatisfied in order for innovation to happen. What happens if it feels as though you're the only one that can see the need for things to change, and you're the only one that's dissatisfied? Any advice?
Oh, no one can recognise that, can they? I mean, it is hard. And sometimes that might not be the soil in which you're called necessarily to try and make the innovation. I think my guess is that in Caroline's church, they wouldn't have all been up for change. I think they were very ordinary, brilliant. Ordinariness is good, but I don't think they were a particularly innovative congregation. But I think the way that Caroline told the story to them, we've always supported overseas mission. Overseas has come to our doorstep. What are we going to do about it? That was really compelling. It's one of the best short stories I've come across. So I think one of the ways to, as it were, help people to share your dissatisfaction is to find good questions. So, for example, I think, I look back to the time when I was in the parish. I think I would have done well to have raised the satisfaction levels among my congregation if every year I'd said, right, I've just done a head count. We lost 10 people. We've gained 11 or 10 or 9 or whatever it is. We gained 10 people. 8 of those were transferring from another church. 1 had left church. 1, amazingly, had got very little church background. If I was able to find that 1, it would have been a miracle. But I might have said to them, are we really satisfied? And so I think to do the stats every year, to show them the results, and then to keep saying, are we satisfied? And that invites them to make a response, where to say, yes, we are satisfied is slightly ludicrous. Okay.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment, say how helpful I found that last line, tradition is the soil within which innovation grows. As a parish with a missional community thriving in its 3rd year, and at times on the edge of chaos. As the rector with parish oversight, I find a lot of energy is spent in trying to keep traditional church and the missional community together, liking each other. So I thought your comment starting out, tradition, dissatisfaction leads to innovation, and innovation only takes root when it connects with tradition, is something I've really taken to heart today, and I would want to convey as well as I can when I get back. And I know our pioneers are here today, and I think that's been really helpful to us all.
Great.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
I think I got what you're saying about the stories that need to be told and how important that is. And I've picked up a pioneer as well. Were you listening? Hello. Tell us the stories back to church. The only bit that made me feel a little bit uneasy, and I'm not quite sure, in your example, so she told 3 stories to the church, to someone else I've forgotten, but then to the Sri Lankan women, she told them another story. And it just had shades of the sort of the marketing bait and switch thing. And I'm just wondering about how does that sit? If you're going to innovate something, do you want to bless a group of women with a language school, or have you got another agenda? So where does the sort of the ethics of that lie with integrity?
Yeah. No, I think the ethics of this, there are 2 types of ethics. One is, are the stories consistent? If you put them alongside each other, are they consistent? Which they were. But secondly, is the story that you're telling to, say, in this case, the Sri Lankan women, is it a slightly manipulative story because you're inviting them on a journey that they don't know what the full consequences are? And I think that is a real issue for all of us in all walks of life, but in pioneering. Now, I think when you do something under the banner of the church, that immediately sets up sort of permission for certain things. I think every step you go, you have to ask the people involved. So I don't know what she did, but if I'd been Caroline and her team, I'd have said to the women, we're thinking of putting up a prayer board. Would you like that? How would it work? Because if the participants are involved in every step, that's fine. If when they came to run an alpha course, they said to the participants, we're thinking of doing this. Is this an okay thing for us to do? Are you happy with this? And someone to come, that's fine. So that's part of the answer. But I think the other part of the answer is, in fresh expressions circles, what we observe time and again is that these new ventures, they follow a pattern. There's listening, there's loving and serving, there's building community with those you love and serve. Then they're sharing the gospel. Perhaps people come to faith and something with the flavours of church takes shape around that and they go and do it again. So I think the important thing here is to value each of those stages as an end in itself. So that even if, for Caroline, even if she'd never got to putting in the prayer board, that would still have been a brilliant venture. It would have been a fantastic for the kingdom. It would have been a wonderful initiative. And I think that the danger is if people who are passionate about evangelism see these things only as instruments to evangelism, then they become means to an end, and that has got connotations that are really unhelpful. So thank you for sort of intuiting that, enabling me to be explicit.
Hiya. I was interested in your edge of chaos stage, because in this story, Caroline continues to innovate. So how do you hold the line between holding to original vision, so this is what we've been called to do, and possibly as an original innovator then finding that you no longer have the vision to take it to another stage and handing it on to someone else? So how do you hold vision versus releasing and allowing someone to take it to places you couldn't take it?
I don't think there's a formula, but there's probably a disposition of heart. And the disposition of heart is one that says, the Lord seemed to give us this vision, and it's a vision for the moment. Is it still the moment? And are we willing for the Lord to move that vision on and, enable us to tell different stories? And I think it's a disposition of heart that says the vision was a gift from the Spirit. So am I open for the Spirit to give me another gift, or to, as it were, amplify or change that gift? And so there's a whole thing here about, is this vision now mine which I hold? and I understand the language, but I kind of slightly resist the language for that reason? Or is this a vision that's serving us quite well at the moment, but we need to be open for the Spirit to give us something new?
Charles Handy has his sigmoid curve where he talks about innovating while you're still on the upward part of the curve, which seems to be a slightly different model to innovating at the point of dissatisfaction. And I just wonder if there is also something about innovating from a point of view of just sort of a positive conviction that this is something we just have to be doing.
No, I think that's good, but the thing is, the moment you've got a positive conviction, what I see out there, it could be so much better. I've got an idea for doing this better. The moment you see that, you then become dissatisfied with the status quo because you see, wow, this is falling short of the ideal, as it were, or falling short of what it could be. So whatever the sequence of thinking, you end up, I think, with a degree of dissatisfaction. And I would say the stronger the dissatisfaction, if it's channeled, the stronger the motivation and drive to take you through the inevitable obstacles and disappointments until, with the folks you're working with, you get to the point of innovation. So I think that I think there's going to have to be dissatisfaction somewhere along the line. A businessman who I know, who was actually the founder of one of the founders of the comedy clubs and has made millions of pounds, who always used to say to me, Mike, if you want to be an entrepreneur and you want a new product, just find people's pain. And sell into people's pain. Well, now that's not my sort of language, but I know what he was trying to say. You've got to find where the dissatisfaction is in your community or whatever, and find ways of addressing it. So it's a multifaceted concept, this.
Last chance. Well, can we thank Mike again very much for coming to share his insight and his wisdom with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.